Okay, and we might kick off. So, welcome everyone. Welcome to another webinar from the Ecrux SEX series. We have a set of different topics upcoming, and if you guys have any other ideas or topics that you'd like us to cover, feel free to reach out to the team. Today, we're going through the anatomy of a Copilot failure. And so, this goes into the different AI use cases we see in the workforce, how enterprise is using Copilot as not only a way to launch AI into their own workforce and use it for many different use cases, but why this strategy hasn't been working and how we can go around fixing a lot of these problems that Copilot is facing and how can we actually make it useful. But as many of you guys already know, every Friday, 9:30 a.m., we're going to be doing a webinar. So myself or member of the team will jump on and we'll be covering a topic related to AI. It can be on AI infrastructure, it could be on AI deployments, trends we see in the market. And as I said earlier, we've got a set of different topics upcoming. But if you guys have any other ideas, feel free to send them through. But okay. Today, we're going to be going through the problem. So we actually have 4 failure archetypes that we've seen with our customers. So these are real examples that our customers face. And then we go through the different fixes that can be implemented for these problems. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. Obviously, Copilot failures are quite prolific, unfortunately. But these are the 4 big deployments that we've seen not go as well, where the fix is not too complicated to implement. It's just dependent on whether or not you have the resources. And then lastly, we'll go through the key takeaways, the principles that you can apply if you're doing a Copilot AI deployment yourself or any AI deployment for that matter. But first, let's kick off with the problem. So why does Copilot not do well, and what's going on with AI deployments across the industry? So 80% of AI projects fail. And we went through this in the last webinar if you were there. 42% of companies abandoned most AI initiatives in 2025. If you were there in the last webinar, this percentage in 2024 was actually 17. So in 2024, 17% of companies abandoned AI initiatives. Now it's 42%. So that percentage has gone up as AI has actually strengthened. So AI has become more precise. It's become more broad in its capability, and it's also become more powerful. But at the same time, enterprises actually are abandoning AI during that increase in AI capability. And we'll explore why. And then the last one, which is probably the most shocking and most relevant to this presentation, is 5% of Copilot deployments actually move to production. 5%. So that suggests 95% of Copilot POCs or attempts are failing, which is a huge statistic. But, talking to a lot of people that work with Copilot, not many of them are surprised. And we'll get into why. So these are the 4 failure archetypes that we've seen with our customers. These are real examples. So the first one is stale data, wrong answers. And another way of saying this is garbage in, garbage out, right? If you're not putting in good data inputs into the model, you're going to get the wrong answers. The second one is AI is quite capable, but if you architect the solution wrong, it may not work out. The third one is schema without meaning. And this one is a bit more of a technical example, but I'll walk you guys through it, what they were trying to achieve, which is quite useful if it was achieved, and the solution to actually making that use case work. And the last one, I think everyone here is going to be able to relate to, which is the forgotten humans, the human element of using AI and rolling out AI. So the first one, stale data, wrong answers. So the problem, or I guess the aspiration here was, you have a company of maybe 30,000 people working across the country, right? And nobody's really talking to each other. even if they do, let's say you have a network within Teams or you have presentations running around and change managers trying to link up the different teams that are essentially operating in silos, it's never a efficient and clean solution. Inevitably, you can have one team doing a piece of work, another team doing another piece of work, and they could be doing the same piece. They could be duplicating effort. Or somebody's doing work that another team member has already done in the past. And another aspect of all this is there's a tremendous amount of knowledge and documentation, code, etc., that's floating around either other teams' repositories or just simply done in the past that not everyone has access to. And so the solution to this problem was, why don't we just get Copilot connected to SharePoint, which has everything, and then just starts getting people to use it, right? Because then users would be able to get everything and anything from it. And so all that knowledge, all that productivity in the past or going on right now, you wouldn't be wasted because everybody would have access to it. And so Copilot essentially becomes this powerful search engine, not hitting Google's database, right? But instead actually hitting the company's own corpus of knowledge and resources. That was the idea. And I thought this was, a pretty common and very useful way of using Copilot. However, we're not seeing it be as successful as it can be. And I'll kind of show you why. So here's the simple architecture I've kind of drew up, right? So it is little Copilot here, right? And what they've done is they've connected to SharePoint. So why did that not work? Well, if you think about it, in SharePoint, you have the final document, which is great. So the presentation ready version of it. But you also have all the previous versions of that same PowerPoint deck or PDF or Word document, right? You have a tremendous amount of versions of that document that's now being fed to Copilot, and Copilot can't tell the difference. So that's one aspect, right? Individuals are getting answers from the wrong document, even though the creator themselves haven't deemed it ready for consumption. Another problem is, let's say hypothetically somebody searched up what is the price of X. Well, if you work in a bank, the cash rate is consistently changing. Your product strategy is also consistently changing. And so if you're getting a document from, let's say, 2022, 2023 versus 2025, that information is going to be outdated. And so there's also that issue, right? Now you start to see where that concept of garbage in, garbage out is quite relevant. If Copilot has access to the corpus of knowledge and documents that the company has today and has had in the past, and there's no indexing of those documents to determine, what's a ready to go document? What has gone through some data governance? What actually is useful to end users? What documents have actually flagged they're not for wider consumption? And how do we remove that from the corpus? If none of that's really done, you're going to get users essentially getting wrong answers or outdated answers from this Copilot use case. And that's essentially what happened with our customer. A lot of users would jump on searching for certain items, and then they end up finding items that sometimes are useful, but sometimes are completely outdated. And in some cases, they take documents or they take terms and conditions or pricing sheets that weren't even relevant to what they were actually looking for today because the information was just simply outdated or wrong. So what is the way to actually fix this? Well, and I'll go back to the diagram to explain this better. But essentially, you need to implement a RAG system. So a RAG system is essentially, and you'll hear this a lot in AI, right? A RAG system is essentially a way of instilling something called embeddings onto documents. So it's essentially getting AI to process documents, and I'm giving you this in a pretty high level, but and please search this up in detail or reach out if you have more questions. But essentially what you're doing is you're taking all these documents and files and you're creating something called embeddings. And so it's essentially a mathematical representation of those documents. And it allows a language model to query those documents very quickly and with strong understanding of the document. And so it becomes more accurate and more fast, right? And the architecture that could have really worked in this case is it's pretty much the same thing, except you have AI Copilot connecting to a RAG pipeline. So RAG is essentially a representation of all those documents mathematically. And between SharePoint and that RAG pipeline, the reason why it's a pipeline is because only the documents that are relevant are being fed through. And so the documents that are the final versions, the documents that are ready for wide consumption, the documents that are essentially good to go for the company, all code. It doesn't have to be files. It can be code, it can be notes, it can be presentations, videos, audio files, etc. But they're essentially files that are good to use for the rest of the company. It's not just the corpus of garbage that even the user themselves wouldn't reuse. So yeah, that's the first archetype. I want to move on to the next one, which is wrong architecture. So this one's pretty interesting. It's a financial services company, and what they did was they wanted to automate an investment analyst's day, right? So each day, ASX announcements, especially during earnings season, ASX announcements are coming every morning, right? It's coming rapid fire. Now, if a company already has implementations or recommendations relevant to X company on ASX, they need to analyze that recent update to determine if their recommendation or implementation, like how they've decided to buy or sell those shares, needs to change, right? Based on the new information that's come through. And so today they have analysts literally crawling ASX, looking at the companies because they have the date for when they report. They try to bring in those documents and they read through the documents. Oh, the current asset has changed. The revenue forecast is different now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? And we see this across many companies. Even that company's competitors will be doing this, right? They're just looking through each other's financial reports. That's an extremely manual process. It takes a lot of time. And so a really good use case for Copilot is to extract these data points for us, right? Put the documents in a certain area, extract the data points, maybe create a summary. That's automation, and that's not only save time, but it's probably going to be more accurate because when you're crawling it through documents of so many pages, you might be getting it wrong, right? Copilot's able to scan the whole thing, find exactly where all the pages where revenue is stated and how it's stated, and if there are any conflicting data points with the revenue figures. And so Copilot is a very good solution for this use case. So why did it fail? The reason why it failed was actually just how they used Copilot, how they built it. So forgive the diagram, right? This is my this is my best attempt at showing this. But essentially what they had was they had these earning reports that they were generating. They were using something they called the extraction Copilot, right? But it wasn't going and hitting the documents. It was hitting something they called a POI table, so point of interest table, right? And this table was generated by another agent from the documents. And so what they were doing is they'll crawl through the documents, they'll have a set number of parameters that needed to be pulled from these documents, let's say revenue, they'll put in this table. And then now Copilot just needs to talk to this table, right? And the reason they did this is because with the tremendous amount of documents on the ASX, if they had Copilot hitting all those documents, they thought it'd be slow, they thought it'd be inaccurate, they thought Copilot get confused. So they wanted to give it a clean table to query. The problem with this, right, is let's say hypothetically I have revenue and profit by year, which is great, right? So now if anybody asks us any questions to do revenue by the year, boom, that's perfect. It'll answer the question perfectly, right? But let's say somebody said, I want revenue by year by product. Or I want to understand the depreciation of X, how has that impacted my net profit? If that's not in that table, Copilot can't answer the question. And now the user goes back to the document and says, well, no, I can see in note 3 of the financial statements that information is available. Why can't Copilot do it? And that that's not a problem with Copilot, but it's given Copilot a bad reputation. But that's not a problem with Copilot. That was a problem with the architecture. That Copilot instance only had access to this table. And so the fix for this, right, is you want Copilot interacting directly with what we mentioned earlier, which is essentially all these documents in one place in a RAG system, Copilot querying it directly. It'll be fast, it'll be accurate, and you won't miss out on any data points. And so that was a problem with architecture. And there was another side insight with this one as well, which is these analysts, because they're pretty smart people, they were already using Claude on the side, right? And using Claude is a bit dangerous because essentially whatever you put in Claude, all that data is going to the US and you have no control over it. Copilot is at least something that the company knows and understands what you're querying, what data you're putting in, what data you're extracting. But if they're using external Claude, you essentially have no traceability over any usage, right? But they were using Claude and they were comparing the Claude responses to this new Copilot instance. And they just thought, wow, Claude has all the information and Copilot doesn't. And they started thinking, wow, Copilot's just a really bad version of Claude, which is not necessarily the case. It was just this Copilot instance didn't have access to all the data points so you could answer the question. Where Claude, if you're a user of Claude, you can upload documents in what they call projects, which is essentially a RAG implementation. And so it does have the answers to all the questions. But yeah, the fix for that really is build that RAG pipeline. You'll be better than Claude because Claude, if you're using it as an external user, it's limited in the amount of documents you can upload. You have to manually put the documents in there. If they created that pipeline where Copilot essentially connected to RAG, which connected to the API endpoint, pulling all the documents in from the ASX, it wouldn't be an issue. It'd be accurate, it'd be fast, all the questions would be answered, and the investment analyst would be pretty happy with the product. Now let's go to number 3. I know it is a Friday morning, so we are halfway through. This one is schema without meaning, and so this is a pretty common use case, right? Executives need data points really fast, right? They don't want a good data analyst to tell them how it can't be done, and they definitely don't want to wait for it. And so wouldn't it be great if the executive could talk to an agent and say, hey, I need to know X, Y, and Z. Let's say that they need to know, hey, last week, how many sales did we make? Right? And what are the value of those sales? Who's my best salesperson? They don't ever want to learn how to use a dashboard. They want the answer as a person is interacting with them. And we see this pretty commonly, right? Even if the data analyst has built a dashboard, sometimes the dashboard doesn't answer the question because it's very nuanced. Or the executive doesn't like using the dashboard because the executive has a lot of things going on. So then data analyst has to open a dashboard or do manual queries and figure out the answer. This is essentially text to SQL, but it's basically getting the Copilot agent to generate the SQL query that would answer the person's question, query the database, and then come back with the answer, right? And in some cases, generate a visualization. So this is a pretty common use case. Copilot should be able to do it. But why does it not work? And this doesn't work. I've seen it not work, not only with Copilot, I've seen it not work with many different LLMs that people are using. So it is not isolated to Copilot at all. Why does it not work? Well, it's because the schema doesn't have any meaning. I remember joining, actually a long time ago, I was at PwC consulting and I was onboarded to ANZ, right? And I was doing some data work for them. And they had no documentation on their database, right? They had like some basic stuff such as tables, columns for the main tables they use for reporting, right? They didn't have, firstly, let's say a table was transactions, right? And it had transaction codes as one of the columns. So you have transaction code 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. None of those codes actually had the definition. So I didn't know code 3 was deposits or code 4 meant an ATM withdrawal. Just no idea, right? And now, why would they represent this as numbers in the database? Why wouldn't they just say ATM withdrawal? Well, that's a really long string, and you need to think about database efficiency, right? And so they build it to be efficient. And so there's a lot of definitions in there that's not captured anywhere, right? It's not documented anywhere. I mean, think about all the projects in a company that you do, and you don't do the documentation because executive wants it released. Nobody cares about documentation afterwards. That's how a database works as well. You have an extreme amount of tables, columns, and then within each one of those columns, fields that nobody really knows what it actually means, right? And then there are new features coming out, like there's a new app, there's a new way to pay, etc., etc. And now there's even more fields coming into that table, and now the documentation's out of date, etc. And so, how does a person get around this? I got around this by literally creating an account and then having like doing actions and then having the data points come through in a database and correlating that back to what I did. And so I didn't rely on documentation, I relied on experimentation. Copilot can't do that. And so if you ask Copilot a question and it doesn't have access to documentation that explains all this, it essentially can't answer the question. And so that data documentation, that data prep is essentially 90% of the work. It's not Copilot doing the heavy lifting. It's the people that are prepping that data ready for Copilot that's actually adding the value. And so what you have to have is a comprehensive semantic layer. You have to have some examples of SQL queries for the AI to reference this as a pattern. So if I'm going for accounts, this is a SQL query used. Copilot will be able to understand, okay, this is the account table that would answer these questions. Show the user what was queried. In some cases that would help, some cases it wouldn't, but it's always good to be completely transparent. And that's the way essentially to make Copilot work in this use case. You have to have an extreme amount of documentation ready for Copilot to understand all the tables, columns, and fields it's using. Now, the last one is a pretty common one. I think it's a really easy one to end with. So I think a lot of executives across the industry has said, hey, I want AI all over. I want it everywhere. I want all my teams using it. I want my sales teams on it. I want even my customers on it, right? And the best shortcut method to doing that is essentially roll out Copilot and give everybody access, right? I've seen this done, and a lot of people don't even know where Copilot is. They don't even know how to access it. And then the people that know it's there are a mix of kind of three categories, right? You have the people that are AI anxious, so they don't want to lose their jobs, so they're not going to learn Copilot. The second category is Copilot's there. I don't know how to use it. I don't even know by clicking on it what it can help me with, right? They just don't really understand it. They don't use AI on the side. So then, oh well. And then the third category is Copilot's developed a bad reputation, maybe through a previous bad implementation, or they tried it and it didn't work, or it bugged out because they just released it. There are a lot of reasons why people won't use it and why a simple rollout just won't occur. And so if you look at the statistics around Copilot adoption, it's extremely low. And I would say that the real issue here is that it's a people problem, not a technology problem. But not the people that have been given access, but the people that rolled it out. You have to have a level of change management. You have to have a lot of internal marketing to show everybody how it can be useful. Instead of talking about AI, find some champions. Champion within this team. Okay, get that champion to come up 2 or 3 examples of how they can use Copilot in their everyday. Talk about Copilot as a way of people upskilling themselves, creating not only a future for the company, but a future for themselves and their career. The faster they adopt AI, the more competitive they will be in the workforce. And so this should be an exciting endeavor for them. And so it really is that change management, internal communication, and also letting people know that they will not be automated by Copilot. And that's an essential aspect to making this successful. But yeah, those are the four examples. These are real examples, and actually examples you guys can relate to. I'm sure you guys have actually seen these implementations fail in practice. And these fail not only with Copilot, but with any other AI, LLM that they've utilized. But the four examples are stale data, wrong answers, wrong architecture, limiting a really good use case, schema without meaning, so not enough documentation, and then the forgotten humans in this AI world. But yeah, with that, thank you so much. I appreciate you guys joining the webinar. As always, we do this every Friday morning, 9:30 a.m. The ACRUX webinar series will continue. It'll be myself or another member of our team presenting. But if you guys have any interesting topics, feel free to send them through. We're more than happy to help. And with that, I might just leave it to some questions. The first question is, does RAG distinguish between good and bad documents? Or is that done manually as a pre-processing step? Yeah, it's a really good question. So it is done as a pre-processing step, and it kind of comes through in two ways. One, it's within SharePoint, have the flag for people to flag whether or not something is good to go or not good to go. And then another piece of logic that we'll probably be using another LLM, but basically a language model would scan that document, make sure that it's appropriate. So make sure that there isn't words like not ready for wider consumption, or it isn't any sensitive information with PII data in there. And so those two would be your pre-processing. And once it goes through into the RAG, it's ready to go. Are there situations where you think GPT Mini is actually a better solution? Yeah, there is. I mean, a smaller model responds faster. So the big models are more accurate. They're able to do more reasoning. They're able to solve more problems, but they're slower. And so Mini is useful when essentially a very fast response has to be provided. Now, obviously, it's likely that the model is deployed on a GPU, so GPUs are slower, right? I use GPUs for gaming, right? I think all of us do, if you play games. Where if these models are deployed on ASIC chips, similar to the Southern Cross infrastructure, you probably don't have to use a smaller model for speed. You could use a bigger model deployed on the right architecture for speed. Why does Copilot not work as well as ChatGPT? Well, well, you see, Copilot probably had to be changed and limited based on the rules and configurations that the company chose. And also, we don't know this, but it could be also the plan that they signed up for. But I agree. I've used Copilot and I've used ChatGPT. It does seem like Copilot is not as powerful. What is my favorite Copilot alternative to use on AI deployments? I mean, I am biased. I work for SCX. So SCX has 17 different models available, and they include many different open source alternatives. The most recent one that was released was Minimax, and my humble opinion is that it is a very strong alternative. And I use models dependent on the use case. And so, for example, Minimax is one that's really good for coding. I like to use the Chinese model DeepSeek for reasoning. And so it depends. It depends on a use case. So I always like to keep my options broad and open, because different LLMs are better at different things, and just using GPT is probably not always the best decision, in my humble opinion. But yeah, those are the four questions that we got. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to send them through. But I hope you enjoyed this webinar, and reach out if you guys have any questions. Thank you.